Let's get started. My name's Rose Espinola. I use they, them pronouns. And I had a lot of the same questions that you all did. And they continue to come up for me around metrics. I first started organizing 12 years ago as part of a majority women, majority people of color collective when I was in college, and we forced our university to publicly divest $15 million from a company with labor rights violations, and other universities followed us and workers won a union. And I kept being part of these really big victories. And about 5 years into organizing, I said, what if we actually tracked data and followed up with everyone who says they want to be involved? I don't know if you've had a similar experience. And the place to get that training was with the Democratic Party. So I went to work for the Florida Democratic governor's race in 2014, and I learned how to do analytics, with the idea that I was going to bring that back to my advocacy work. And since then, I've worked at Planned Parenthood, and I've worked at Public Citizen, and Bernie 2016, and I think a lot about metrics and how we can use them in a way that supports our organizing rather than distracts. All right. So you might see my screen share. Hopefully everyone sees my screen share. Please double click on that screen share in order to make it bigger. So in today's session, we are going to focus on organizing to get a target to do a demand. We also can talk about electoral work because I saw that coming up in the chat box, especially with folks who are switching from door knocking to more digital and phone work right now. We're going to practice brainstorming. Oh, give me a second. We're going to practice brainstorming data that shows our power, and we're going to understand considerations for setting weekly metric goals. And we'll have time for questions, of course. Cool. So I want to get an idea. How many of you have done labor or advocacy organizing? In the chat box, write labor or advocacy. Cool. A lot of people have done labor and advocacy organizing. How many of you have done electoral organizing? Okay, and how many of you have done both, like the advocacy / labor style of organizing and electoral organizing? Both, all? Cool. So I'm asking this question because a lot of the tools we have, a lot of our data practices come from the electoral space. And when I say electoral, I mean candidate campaigns, where we're trying to get a specific person elected, and also ballot campaigns where we're trying to delegalize marijuana, for example. And on an electoral campaign, we win if we get a certain number of people to vote. It's a numbers game. And so setting metrics on an electoral campaign can, at the surface level, be pretty simple. Though even on electoral campaigns, we do want to think about, are we setting metrics that are helping us grow election day? Labor and advocacy organizing, on the other hand, is different. So we might be organizing for a collective bargaining agreement. We might be organizing for on a corporate campaign to get a CEO to provide hazard pay or increased pay for workers who are working during COVID, or for them to stop dumping toxic materials in a river near our house. We might also be talking about legislative or grassroots lobbying campaigns. And in this style of organizing, we win when we force our target to give us what we want. And if you have thoughts as I'm speaking, I love when people like put things in the comment box. Since I can't have you like on video and see your faces with me. And so I've seen this kind of tension when we are working on labor and advocacy campaigns. I had a boss at one point who like she had come from the electoral space, and we were organizing on a campaign to make a decision maker give us what we want. And she was like, okay, you should set goals for every week of like number of petition signers. And I was like, well, the end goal is actually that we implement this thing. And she was like, but how will you know when you win? And I said, well, no, because we'll have implemented it, but I can't say 10,000 signatures will get us there, or 10 signatures will get us there. Because actually, there's this question of how do we get what we want? And in advocacy and labor, it is not a numbers game, which can be in juxtaposition with the idea of setting metrics. So advocacy and labor campaigns, we're going to increase our frequency of actions. We're going to increase number of people at actions and heighten our tone in order to get our target to give us our demand. In order to win comprehensive sex ed in Arizona, where when I was at Planned Parenthood, we passed the most comprehensive sex ed policy in Arizona history, right? Or in order to win a union, or in order to defeat a horrible trade agreement like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So on an electoral campaign, we're trying to get more people to vote for us than the other option, whereas on labor and advocacy campaigns, it's a question of putting pressure on our target to give us what we want by putting more and more pressure on them. Someone asked me to go back and I realized I went a little fast. So we can increase pressure on a target through frequency of actions, number of people at actions, online or offline, and I'll share these slides after so you can have some of the detail, or through heightened tone. And so we get what we want on advocacy and labor campaigns by making it impossible for our target to go about business as usual. Again, how do we use that then to set metric goals for ourselves and for the staff who we work with? Rather than starting with the metric goals we want to set and then trying to fit it back into our campaign work, I want to start with what tactics do we use to win? So in the chat box, I want to ask, what tactics would you use to put pressure on a boss to give workers hazard pay during COVID? They could be online or offline tactics, and it could be something like an online petition. Oh, people are already suggesting things. So bird dogging, phone zap, embarrass them in the media. Sick out, lock him in the room, 1 hour walkout, singing in the store. Letter to the editor, online stories of workers in the media, general strikes, boycotts. Keep them coming. Get spouse, loved one to talk to them and put pressure on them. Digital town hall. Workers wearing buttons. an art installation. What I really like about the things that people are suggesting right now is that they put pressure on the boss to do our demand. It's not this, so I would say that sometimes we say, I just need to talk to 10 people. And the challenge there is that the boss doesn't know we've talked to 10 people unless we get the 10 people to also go talk to the boss. And the tactics that folks are laying out in the chat box help us get hazard pay rather than being concerned with meeting some metric goal. But we're going to talk about metric goals now that we've brainstormed some tactics. So considering the tactics we laid out, let's create metrics for our campaign against the boss. We're putting pressure on the boss to provide hazard pay. And so now that we know the kind of tactics that we could use, I want to know what data describes our power. And so one example could be the number of one-on-ones we have. So when I started managing Latinx organizing for Planned Parenthood's national office, the staff that I was managing, they had been tabling every week. And when I asked them about one-on-one conversations, they said most of them weren't doing that and hadn't built like local committees. And so I said, well, we're going to have a new metric goal. Like every organizer on our team is going to have 6 one-on-ones per week. And as people started to have 6 one-on-ones per week, they started to identify leaders or identify organizers, depending on the language you like to use. And it was like, by changing our metric, we could actually focus on tactics that build power and get us closer to making our target do our demand, which, for example, was passing comprehensive sex ed, which we were able to pass in Arizona. So what data describes our power if we're putting pressure on the boss to provide hazard pay? And again, think back to the tactics we just brainstormed. Someone said yes to one-on-ones, measure number of people participating in workplace gatherings. It's really good. In the chat box, what data describes our power? RSVPs to sit in. Views, clicks, actions taken. Ooh, I love Tim Zhu said assessments on willingness to participate. So you give each supporter a score. Someone who's a 1 is all in and is like leading meetings. Someone who's a 3 might still be neutral. Number of workers signing petitions. Number of people talking on social about boycott. Percent of workplace engagement. Cool. Do you see how here people reached back to the tactics in order to brainstorm metrics? So what that means is that we can actually set our own metrics rather than the development team, for example, saying a funder wants us to meet this metric. And the next question I want to ask is, what data will be required by an external entity? So when I say what data will be required by an external entity, I mean sometimes a funder, like let's say we got some foundation money. Sometimes that foundation will want to know, how many supporters do you have? And that leads to something called vanity metrics, where we want to inflate the number. So I've heard of organizations that will say, well, any person who likes our post is a supporter, right? Or they might say, how many people have come to your events in the last year? Ooh, Crystal said Funder wants to know the number of people on our list, not the number of active people, just the number of people. So people are also saying, did the boss call a meeting? Did they change policy? So an external entity might also want to know things that do describe our power. Like number of workers affected, number of mentions in the media. Cool. So what we'll start to notice is that there is overlap between the data that describes our power and the data that's required by an external entity. And I saw a comment from Marion that I really liked, that these data points are describing implementation of strategy versus whether or not we whether or not we won, which that's a really good way of putting it. Wilder said foundations want to break down on the budget. That's a really good one. So what data tells our story? And it can be some of the same stuff we already talked about. And someone asked about data that can't be counted, like stories. And that's just as important. So we have data that we can count, like number of supporters, number of volunteers, number of workers who are wearing buttons. But then we also have data that that isn't just a number. It could be a story we collect from someone, but we can turn it into a metric by saying we want to collect this number of stories. It could be one story per week. So the data that tells our story could be how many workers are sick or injured. What other data tells our story? PPE on hand. In the chat box, please type what data tells our story. Picture quotes. Illnesses and deaths that could have been prevented by, that have been prevented by PPE. Population and demographic makeup, risk management requests, how many people would lose services, local demographics versus national. And when we talk about metrics, we're talking about things that can be counted. And in a minute, we're going to talk about why. Why do we even care about metrics? My last question for now is, what data is ethically driven by curiosity? So as an organizer on this campaign, in the chat box, write down any data that you would be really curious to collect. So workers' access to healthcare and treatment options, pay of management versus frontline workers, and that could also help tell our story. Demographics. What is the racial background of workers? COVID-19 death demographics among workers. Time spent implementing tactic versus impact so that we can better prioritize our organizers' stretch time. Personality types of workers. That's really interesting. Number of workers impacted by inequality and economic displacement related to COVID. How many people are we reaching on WhatsApp and other apps? And there's a question about whether we can save the chat from Jen Rivera. And yes, we can copy and paste it into a doc at the end. But when we tried that after yesterday's session, it was about 150 pages. So if someone would like to take that on, you can do that, and I will work with you to make sure it gets sent to everyone who RSVP'd for this session. And also a lot of the chat comments are being shared in a notes doc that Shanna just posted about. Shanna, can you share that link again? So another piece of data driven by curiosity that I want to shout out was from David Jimenez, and he said they said what organizations workers might belong to outside of work. All right. So let's talk about why we set weekly goals. And we're also going to have time to think about other types of campaigns too. I saw a comment about mutual aid, and I know there's also folks with state voices in the room. So why do we set weekly goals? Or why do we set metric goals, this could say? And we do it for a few reasons. We want to focus on the most important areas of our work. For example, one-on-one conversations. Or I might want to know how many people have been to at least 3 events. So rather than using some fancy algorithm, though, I might also want to know how many people our organizers can count on to be local leaders. And that's more qualitative. And I actually think there's a lot of value in having organizers work with work with our base rather than using some sort of like algorithm in the computer to tell us whether or not someone is a leader. We set weekly goals for accountability, which I think someone had brought up at the beginning. Working on a state table and how you come up with metrics, and then you want to assess it. And that goes into the next thing, to evaluate progress, strengths, and weaknesses. When I was working on the governor's race in Florida, there was one person on my team who hated phone banking, and there was another person who hated canvassing. And I was like, well, I don't care. Like, you can canvass all day and you can phone bank all day. And we were able to make that kind of decision because we looked at our data as individuals and as a team, and we're able to process strengths and weaknesses. Also, on different teams that I've managed, sometimes like on the governor's race or at Planned Parenthood, by paying attention to people's strengths, I was able to help them develop skills that in areas that they were excited about and were really good at. So there was one person who was really good at data. And we could tell that because because her data was always super clean, right? And so she ended up being like the data captain for the team. And the person who always had the highest phone banking numbers became the phone banking captain for the team. And teammates were able to go to that person and ask them questions. We also were able to say, like, if in this one region we're doing really well in a certain area, why is that? And then figure out if we should make shifts in other regions. Sometimes to what we're doing, but sometimes to the goals themselves, because almost always we need to have different goals in different regions. So a note is that metric goals on both issue or advocacy, labor, and electoral campaigns will need to be tweaked or entirely changed as time goes on. And I think that that's something that is just really important. So many organizations do electoral issue, aid, plus other types of organizing. And what that means is we want to create short-term metric goals for electoral and advocacy campaigns. And then we want to create long-term metric goals for membership and growth, which could be number of members or number of supporters, or it could be, we could measure this, like how engaged our members are. So one last activity before we move into questions. In the chat box, beyond our hazard pay campaign, thinking about aid work our organization might do, or thinking about a get out the vote work our organization might do, I want you to write a metric goal that is important for our organizations, that is important for the long-term success of our organization. And we can say 10 years into the future. So Alejandra said that in 10 years, an important metric will be how many new members the organization has. Marianne said new leaders engaged and trained. Increased base worker pay by a certain amount. That's really good. Amount of legislation passed. Union density. Legislative implementation. Staff and board of organization reflect the community you're organizing, or the community we're organizing. So these are the things that we could track across campaigns, and that we should track. Cool. I want to leave this here. This was just an introduction. There's so many other things we can talk about with data and metrics and organizing. And I know there were a lot of questions, and I took some notes. So I can start going through some of those questions now. And also, if folks have more questions, please put them into the chat box. And if you have answers to questions that are coming up, also put them into the chat box. Thank you all. And it's great to see how many people are participating, especially in this format. Okay, so Sarah had a question about what if you're fully a volunteer team? And this is an opinion question, I would say. I would say that if you are a fully volunteer team, working on a campaign to make your target give you what you want, that accountability is important. So you want to make sure people are committing to do things when you have like your core meeting or your committee meeting every week. But I actually think that metric goals are not important. I think metric goals are really important especially in nonprofit spaces and in labor organizing spaces. And if folks disagree with me, you can feel free to say so in the chat box, because I really think that that's a question of opinion, and it's something I've struggled a lot with myself. I do think data is important though, Sarah. And so even if you're not giving yourself a metric goal of we each are going to get 100 new petition signatures per month, you do want to be collecting petition signatures, and you do want to be data entering all those petition signatures, because you want to make sure you're following up with everybody. And metric goals can help you as a volunteer collective make sure that you are tracking data and following up with people. So Emilio just asked, it sounds like our org should decide on which tactics we want to use and then extrapolate what metrics apply. I would say yes. And so first you decide on what's your demand and who's your target. Then you decide on what tactics to use. And then you decide on the metrics. And then I would take it a step even further and say, if you work at a nonprofit and you're applying for foundation money or you're pitching to donors, then you share those metrics with those external folks rather than them sharing metrics with you. Okay, let me see what other questions I had collected. Crystal is our moderator. Are you able to help bring up some of the questions? Thank you.
So one of the reasons was what advice do you have for working across field comms metrics to meet both, but also as we are layering tactics, accountability will be blurry because of the metrics. So that was, I believe, from Alejandra. So if I didn't get that right, Alejandra, please put it in the chat.
Yeah. So I think that it's important for like that field director and that comms director to be having regular one-on-ones because like the relationship is central, which might not have been the answer you expected from me. And then if I were the field director, I would ask the comms director, what do you need from me? And I would try to understand why they need it. And so they might say to me, oh, I have this goal of like a certain number of letters to the editor. And I would think about how can we use those letters to the editor to make our target give us our demand and to build our base. And then I would I'd be like, here's some of the things I can get you. And turn that into some sort of metric goal and bring it back to our organizers. I would also, like I said, I'm trying to figure out what the thing that comms does, how does that fit back into our target and demand? And I also want to know how can comms support the field team, and maybe some metrics can come from there. Maybe comms says, oh, we could do spokesperson trainings for your grassroots organizers. And so maybe that becomes a metric if we agree that would help us win our demand.
And a recent question from Kate is, what words of advice do you have for someone nervous to create metric goals for a new project? And Kate, I don't know if you have any other context you want to add to that. My quick words of advice is just do it. We'll see what Rose says.
I would say that you should focus on 5 or less metrics and maybe set them for yourself each week. So say something like, my 5 metric goals I'm going to focus on are one-on-ones, number of supporters, number of events, I don't know, and 2 more. And then you set goals for yourself for this week, for next week, for the 3rd week, and 4th week. And keep in mind that at any point, but definitely by the 4th week, you are going to pause and say, are these metrics working, or should I change the metrics that I'm tracking?
And I just want to say, especially if you asked a question earlier, you should retype it to make sure we don't miss it, because I know we've had a lot of great participation. Kath had a comment question. I struggle with having to create my own dashboards to track and share metrics so that larger teams that aren't data geeks can really reflect together on our work. Do you have thoughts on that, Rose?
Yes, I think Excel is the most underrated organizer skill, or Google Sheets. And I know basic code, Python, SQL, HTML, but I use Excel. And so I recommend that people learn how to do a VLOOKUP in Excel and count it. So I would say learn Excel. And if you're interested, I'm actually partnering with Repower on an online learning course on building analytics dashboards in Excel. And I'll drop that link into the chat, and I'll also share CP'd.
This is a question from Ruben. What are your thoughts on setting goals for a new mutual aid network, or simply connecting a community with resources during this pandemic if you don't have a formal network?
Yeah. So Ruben, I saw that and I was like, I was hoping that I would get to answer that during this time. And I've been thinking about this like the last few days too. And the reality is when I've participated in mutual aid, the idea was to create a new world. And I think that it becomes so unique to the people who are building this alternative to decide what is important to you, and what you want to track. And you could use those questions, though, as a guide. I just put them back up on the screen. What data describes our power? What data will be required by an external entity? What data tells our story? And what data is ethically driven by curiosity? And Ruben, I'd love to hear what you come up with. You can email me, because this is something that I want to like keep thinking about.
This is a question from Carrie. What are some other comms metrics beyond media coverage and increased followers engagement on social can be set, since paid media often is outpacing earned? And I will just throw in that I really appreciate what you said, Rose, about field and comms working together, because I started in field and now I'm in comms. So I think all comms should really appreciate and do field work too. I'm biased.
Hi, Carrie. I would say that you start with what comms tactics could put pressure on your target. Or if you're doing get out the vote work, what comms tactics gets a person to go vote? And from there, create metrics. There's a really cool tool for comms that I don't think I could pull up now, but again, email me and I can send it to you.
And another question is, what criteria do you use to determine if the metrics are working or not?
And this links back to a question I saw Melissa Byrne ask, which is, what if the metrics show the tactics aren't working? So, the first part of this is, how do you determine if the metrics are working? I think that as an organizer who comes out of labor and who really likes the style of organizing where we get our target to do our demand. It's, are we winning our shorter term demands? Like, we're not going to immediately get hazard pay. We're probably going to get a meeting with the boss as a first step. And if we're still not getting that meeting with the boss, then our tactics probably aren't working and our metrics probably aren't working. I think you can also look at, are you meeting your goals, which is a separate question. But sometimes you know that you're not tracking the right thing if you're not meeting your goals.
Another question, this comes from Wilder, and please, Wilder, like, put in the chat if you've got more context on this. It just says measuring equity online.
Yeah. Oh, there was one other thing where Melissa said, how do we shift the goals without hurting people, shift metric goals without hurting people's feelings? And I have found that creating dashboards, especially in Excel or Google Sheets, so just like creating a visual, is extremely effective. So when I deliver a report to others, like to my boss, let's say, I just show them this table I created, and I can say, these are my recommendations, but what do you think?
And before you move on to the question about equity, there were some other like comments and questions. I think, as is typical, people are hungry for like tools and templates and things you might have, especially around like analytics. So I don't know what all what pieces of all your knowledge base people can expect in the follow-up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to end with Wilder's question, and then folks should feel free to trickle out, go on to the next session, but I'll also stay in the room and answer some more questions. Like, you could think about it as, if we were in real life, I would just be standing there, but people would be getting up and mingling. So the last question from Wilder is, how are we able to be equitable online and actually measure our success in those efforts? So at one job at one organization I was at, I was like, great, there's a commitment to diversity. So we're never going to put on a panel again that doesn't have at least 50% women. And we came up with a percentage of people of color. And I said, great, we won't sponsor events then. When people come and ask us for funding, we won't sponsor events that also don't meet that. And so I'm trying to think through online spaces. And something to consider would be who is centered in the space. And I'm like thinking this through as like right now. I think who is centered is extremely important in an online space, especially if it's like a closed space, like a Slack or a Facebook group. I'm on the mod team for Nonprofit Happy Hour, which is a 40,000 person Facebook group of community support. And anyway, so I think I would look at what percentage of moderators and what percentage of members are people living with chronic illness, or are people of color, or are women, or are non-binary. And when it comes to people of color, like as a person, as a Chicana, I would even say that, like, my question would be, is this space majority people of color? And if it isn't, then is it equitable for people of color to be invited into spaces but still not be the majority? And I didn't see any of the chats that came through. So thank you, Wilder, for that question. I know folks are going to start trickling out. But if folks want to stick around, I'll start reading the comment box again. And I look forward to hearing from you all on email, and I'll send you resources too. Thank you all. And Kia, I know that we didn't get to your question around get out the vote work, so feel free to email me. Mara, I see your question about my earrings. I tweeted about them. So just go to my Twitter and you can find where to buy them. And if anyone still has questions and wants to stick around, please put them into the chat box. I see Emilio is asking, can I recommend, again, the specific Excel skills? Okay. I would recommend learning VLOOKUP. I'm typing it into the box. COUNTIF, SUMIF, and pivot tables. And if you give me a minute, I will actually send you a link to a 3-week Excel course I'm training on. It's for organizers on how to build analytics dashboards and the prices sliding scale. And we're also, I'm partnering with Repower, formerly Wellstone, and we're going to be hosting VAN, which is the Voter Activation Network, Python and SQL courses as well. All right, well, thank you all for coming. Have a good rest of the conference. I actually saw there was just a question. Nick, are you still there? Right, yes, if you're still there. Okay, so when leadership want organizers to show metrics, when so much of their work is qualitative interactions. So I think that this is where it's really helpful for you to suggest metrics that reflect what's most important for your team. So if most of the interactions are qualitative, then I would be counting one-on-ones. But I think almost every campaign and organization should make one-on-ones one of their most important metrics. And then I would also say that you should have people score folks on a scale, typically of 1 to 5, of how involved they are. And that way it allows for these qualitative interactions and the nuance. I always say to people, like, an algorithm can't tell me if this person is still engaged, because, like, what if now more than ever someone in their family gets sick and they were a volunteer who was, I would call like a local organizer, right? Like they were an organizer themselves, organizing other people, facilitating meetings, and suddenly they can't because someone in their family has gotten very sick. And an algorithm, or a model as it's sometimes called, isn't going to tell us that. Only an organizer can. So I would use a scale of 1 to 5 and train your organizers on it. And I would also think about how you make it easy for your organizers to enter data, or for you yourself to enter data. So, like, is there a way you can do it from your phone? Like, I've built forms that people can enter from their phone. And then also, I think that it's realistic to identify what percentage of your job is going to be reporting. And sometimes that number is 20% of your job, sometimes it's 30%. And I think that that's part of the nonprofit industrial complex. And we can set our own boundaries and say, I'm not going to work at a job where more than 20% of my job is reporting. And you can also set that expectation for yourself if you're already at a job and you know that 30% of your job is reporting. You could just say 30% of my job is reporting. So I don't have 40 hours a week to organize. I only have 28 hours a week to organize. And you can also, if you manage organizers, you can work with them in that way. Set that expectation of 30% of your time is reporting. And that's important because that allows us to get more funds so that we can keep doing our jobs. And when you plan your week, you should plan that you're only going to have 28 hours to actually do organizing. Is that helpful? Nick, can you email me and I'll just email you what the 1 to 5 assessment is? And if you can, Nick, email me also like what kind of organizing you do, in case I like that it impacts what, like, how I respond. Marianne, did you say that you are you work in labor? Yeah. The 1 through 5 scale is very common in labor. Any other questions or comments? I wish I could like turn on audio for all of you. So there's questions about the repower courses. Maggie, the data strategy course, I'm still not sure. So you should sign up for Repower's email list. And you can also email me if you have questions, and I'll see like if I have any resources that I could share with you. And then Mara, you asked about the Google Sheets class. I would say that if you have like an aptitude for figuring things out, like if you are willing to Google when you don't know something, that you'll be fine in the class. And we actually will send out prep work. That's a that's an overview of like what a row is and what a cell is, and like you'll and how to add numbers in Google, and then it'll be the more exciting things that we learn together. Does that answer your question, Mara? Yeah, Mara, if you know how to do sum and know like what a cell is, then that's enough. All right, I'm gonna bounce. Thank you all for like making this into a conversation.